The morning of September 15th, 1892, started like any other in Cedar Falls, Colorado. The air was crisp with the promise of early autumn, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from Miller's Bakery on Main Street. 22-year-old Charlotte Miller moved through the familiar space with practiced grace, her fingers reading the texture of rising dough, her nose detecting the perfect moment when loaves reached golden perfection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had been blind since birth, but in her father's bakery, she was anything but helpless. Every surface, every tool, every corner held its place in the geography of her memory. The cast-iron oven door creaked in a specific way when it needed oil. The wooden paddle scraped against stone with a rhythm that told her when bread was ready to turn. The morning customer rush created a symphony of voices she knew by heart. Mrs. Patterson always ordered 2 loaves of sourdough, young Timothy. Brooks came for sweet rolls before school, and old Mr. Henley preferred his rye bread still warm from the oven. "Charlotte, dear, where did you put the cinnamon?" Her father's voice carried the strain of his 63 years, each word carefully, measured to hide the tremor that had been growing stronger over the past months. "Third shelf, Papa, behind the nutmeg," she called back, her hands never pausing in their work of braiding challah dough. "Same place it's been for 20 years. George Miller chuckled softly, but Charlotte heard the effort behind it. Her father was forgetting things more often lately. Not just where he'd placed ingredients, but entire conversations, customer orders, sometimes even which day of the week it was. She'd been quietly taking on more responsibilities, memorizing customer preferences, managing inventory, even handling the finances that her father no longer trusted himself to calculate correctly. The brass bell above the front door chimed, and Charlotte immediately recognized the heavy, uneven footsteps. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell, your usual dozen dinner rolls?" But instead of his typical gruff response, silence filled the shop. Charlotte tilted her head, listening. Something was wrong. Mr. Caldwell's breathing was labored more than usual, and she could smell something else on him, fear, sharp and acrid. "Miss Miller," he gasped finally, "you and your papa need to get out. Now." "What's wrong?" George Miller emerged from the back room, flour dusting his apron. "Fire!" Caldwell wheezed. "Started at the hotel next door, spread to the hardware store, winds pushing it this way fast." Charlotte's blood turned cold. The buildings on Main Street were built close together, mostly wood construction with shared walls. If a fire had started at the Riverside Hotel 3 buildings down, they had minutes, not hours. "Papa, we need to gather the money box and get out," Charlotte said, already moving toward the counter where they kept their daily earnings. But when she reached for where her father should be, she found empty air. "Papa?" "George?" "Mr. Caldwell," called out. "George, where'd you go?" Charlotte heard her father's voice from the back room, confused and agitated. "Where are my recipes?" "Charlotte, have you seen my recipe book? Mother's bread recipe is in there. I can't leave without Mother's recipe." Her heart sank. The stress was triggering one of his episodes, moments when the present slipped away from him entirely, and he became lost in memories from decades past. Her grandmother had been dead for 30 years, but in her father's confused mind, he was searching for a recipe book that had been destroyed in a fire when Charlotte was barely 5 years old. "Mr. Caldwell, how much time do we have?" Charlotte asked, moving toward the back room. "Minutes, maybe less. I can see the smoke from here, and it's getting thicker." Charlotte found her father in the storage room, frantically pulling flour sacks and supply boxes from the shelves, his movements growing more erratic by the second. "Papa, we have to go now," she said gently, taking his arm. "I can't find it, Charlotte. Your grandmother will be so upset if I lose her recipe. She spent years perfecting that bread." His voice carried the confusion of a child who'd lost something precious. Outside, Charlotte could hear shouting now, people running, the sound of belongings being hastily loaded into wagons. The acrid smell of smoke was growing stronger, seeping through the walls of the bakery. "Papa, the recipe is safe. Grandmother told me all her secrets. I have them memorized, remember?" Charlotte lied smoothly, anything to break through his confusion. "But we need to leave now, or we won't be safe." For a moment her father's eyes cleared. "Charlotte, what's happening?" "Fire, Papa. We need to go." But even as understanding flickered across his face, Charlotte heard a new sound that made her stomach. A drop, the deep, hungry roar of flames eating through wood. The fire had reached the building next door. "Miss Miller!" Mr. Caldwell's voice was desperate now. "The whole block's going up." Charlotte grabbed the money box from the counter and her father's arm, guiding him toward the front door. But when they reached it, Caldwell was no longer there. Through the glass, she could see the orange glow of flames dancing across the buildings opposite them. "Which way, Papa? Which way is safe?" But her father was slipping away again, his hand trembling in hers. "I don't know where we are, Charlotte. This doesn't look like our street." The smoke was thicker now, making both of them cough. Charlotte's mind raced through the geography of Main Street, trying to calculate their options. The front door led toward the fire. The back alley was narrow, but it might lead to safety if they could make it past the other burning buildings. "This way, Papa," she decided, pulling him toward the back of the shop. They had made it halfway through the main room when Charlotte heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The deep crack of wooden beams giving way, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the entire building. The roof of the hardware store next door had collapsed, and the fire was now eating through their shared wall. "Charlotte!" Her father's voice was clear again, sharp with terror. "I can see flames." Charlotte could feel the heat now, a wall of scorching air that made her lungs burn. Smoke filled the bakery, thick and black, making it impossible to breathe. She tried to keep moving toward the back door, but her father had stopped, overwhelmed by the chaos around him. "I can't see where we're going," he gasped. "Charlotte, I can't see." "Follow my voice, Papa. Stay close to my voice." But the smoke was so thick now that even Charlotte, who had navigated by sound and touch her entire life, was becoming disoriented. The familiar geography of the bakery was lost in a world of heat and burning air. She could hear timbers groaning overhead, the fire eating through everything her family had built. They were 10 feet from the back door when Charlotte heard her father collapse behind her. "Papa!" She turned back, dropped to her knees, and found him on the floor unconscious. Whether from the smoke or from the stress that had been building in his failing mind, she couldn't tell. But he was dead weight now, and she was a young woman barely 5 feet tall. Charlotte tried to lift him, but she couldn't get him more than a few inches off the ground. The smoke was so thick she could barely breathe, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Above them, she could hear the fire eating through the ceiling, pieces of burning debris beginning to fall around them. She made a choice that went against every instinct she had. "Help!" she screamed as loud as her smoke-damaged lungs would allow. "Someone help us, we're trapped!" The irony was not lost on her. A young woman who had spent her life proving her independence, demonstrating that blindness was not a disability that defined her, was now desperately calling for rescue. But no one answered. The street had been evacuated, and anyone still in the area was fighting for their own survival. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her father's chest and tried again to drag him toward where she thought the back door should be. She managed to move him perhaps 3 feet before her strength gave out completely. The smoke was so thick now that she was coughing continuously, each breath bringing less air and more burning particles into her lungs. Above them, another beam groaned and cracked. Charlotte looked up with eyes that could not see but could feel the heat intensifying and could sense the building dying around them. She lay down beside her father, took his hand in hers, and waited for the end. That was When she heard footsteps, heavy boots, moving fast but purposefully through the smoke and chaos, Charlotte tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper now. The footsteps paused, and she heard something she had never heard before, a voice that was completely silent, but somehow communicated volumes. Large, calloused hands touched her shoulders, then her father's chest. The hands moved with the confidence of someone who understood the crisis, who made decisions without hesitation. In one smooth motion, Charlotte felt herself being lifted, not roughly, but with careful strength that spoke of someone accustomed to handling precious things that might break. She was carried through smoke so thick it seemed solid, past heat that felt like standing next to an open furnace. Her rescuer moved with purpose, never hesitating, never stumbling, as if he could see through the chaos that had trapped her and her father. Cool air hit her face like a blessing. They were outside, away from the immediate danger, and Charlotte could hear her father being placed gently on the ground beside her. She tried to speak, to thank their rescuer, but her throat was raw and her voice was gone. When she finally stopped coughing enough to form words, she realized she was lying on grass, probably in the small park across from Main Street. Her father was breathing steadily beside her, unconscious but alive, and somewhere near them she could sense their rescuer, a presence that was both powerful and gentle. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing if he could hear her, not knowing if he was even still there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back into the story. But there was no response, no voice acknowledging her gratitude, no words of comfort or questions about their condition, just a presence that felt solid and reassuring in a world that had just collapsed around them. Charlotte lay on the grass, holding her father's hand, listening to the sounds of her childhood home burning to the ground. The bakery where she had learned to read the world through her fingertips, where she had proven that blindness was not a barrier to competence and independence, was disappearing in smoke and flame. Everything she had known was gone. Her father was lost in a mind that could no longer be trusted to remember yesterday, let alone navigate tomorrow. She had no money beyond the small amount in the cash box, no home, no livelihood, and no clear path forward. But she was alive. They were both alive. And somewhere in the chaos, a stranger had risked his own life to save two people he had never met, expecting nothing in return. As the sun climbed higher over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows through the smoke, Charlotte Miller began to understand that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. Charlotte woke to the sound of hammering, not the rhythmic pounding of construction, but something more deliberate, metal striking metal with precision and purpose. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar darkness, and for a moment, panic seized her. The air didn't smell like the bakery's yeast and flour. Instead, she caught scents of pine wood, leather, and something else, coal smoke with an undertone of heated iron. She sat up slowly, her throat still raw from the smoke, and immediately felt the texture beneath her hands. A quilt, handmade and well-worn, covered a mattress that was neither the narrow cot from her room above the bakery nor the thin pallet where her father sometimes rested during busy days. This bed was sturdy, crafted from solid wood, with a frame that didn't creak when she shifted her weight. "Papa," she called softly, then louder when there was no response. "Papa, where are you?" The hammering stopped abruptly. Charlotte heard footsteps approaching, the same heavy, purposeful stride she remembered from the fire. A door opened, and she felt a presence enter the room. Large, careful hands touched her shoulder gently, as if asking permission before offering help. She flinched instinctively, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, I don't know where I am. Where's my father?" Silence. Charlotte waited for an answer, but none came. The presence remained near her, patient and still, but offered no words of explanation or comfort. "Can you speak?" she asked, turning toward where she sensed him standing. More silence, but she felt movement. The bed dipped slightly as he sat on the edge, and then gentle fingers took her hand. He guided her palm to his throat, and she felt him swallow, felt the vibration of what might have been an attempt at sound. But no voice emerged. Understanding flooded through her. "You can't speak," she said softly. Are you the one who saved us from the fire?" He guided her hand to nod against his chin. A yes. Charlotte felt tears well up in her eyes. Thank you so much. But where is my father? Is he all right?" The man, she still didn't know his name, stood up and gently took her arm, helping her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, but he waited patiently while she found her balance. Then he led her slowly across the room. The floor was smooth wooden planks, worn but well-maintained. As they walked, Charlotte's fingers trailed along furniture, a dresser, a washstand, a rocking chair by what felt like a window. Everything was simple but solidly built, crafted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who worked with his hands and took pride in doing things right. They stopped, and Charlotte heard another door open. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine trees and mountain streams. Her rescuer guided her onto what felt like a wooden porch, and she heard a familiar voice. "Charlotte? Charlotte? Is that you? Papa!" She turned toward his voice, and he was beside her in moments, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce hug. "I was so worried," George Miller said, his voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "I woke up here and couldn't remember. The fire? Was there really a fire?" "Yes, Papa, the whole block burned. This man saved us." Charlotte gestured toward their rescuer, though she couldn't see him. "I don't know his name." She felt movement beside her, then her father's voice, uncertain. He's writing something." Charlotte heard the scratch of pencil on paper. Then her father reading slowly, "My name is Thomas Brennan. You are safe at my cabin in the mountains above Cedar Falls. Your father has been resting. Are you hurt?" "Thomas," Charlotte repeated, testing the name. It felt solid, dependable. "No, I'm not hurt, just my throat from the smoke." She paused. "Thomas, can you hear us? When will we speak?" More scratching, then her father reading, "Yes. I lost my hearing from a forge accident years ago, but I read, lips and I write. I saw the fire from my workshop and came to help." Charlotte felt a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Your workshop?" "I am a blacksmith," her father continued reading. "My forge is here at the cabin. That is the hammering you heard." The pieces began to fall into place. A blacksmith would be strong enough to carry both her and her unconscious father to safety. He would be accustomed to working alone, to communicating without words, to solving problems with his hands rather than his voice. "How long have we been here?" Charlotte asked. More writing, more reading from her father. 2 days. You both breathe too much smoke. I have been letting you rest and heal." 2 days. Charlotte tried to process this. Everything she had known was gone. Their home, their business, their livelihood. But this stranger had not only saved their lives, he had cared for them, watched over them, and expected nothing in return. "Thomas," she said, speaking toward where she sensed him standing, "we have no way to repay your kindness. We lost everything. In the fire." The scratching of the pencil was more vigorous this time, and her father's voice carried a note of surprise as he read, "You owe me nothing. I help because it is right to help. You are welcome to stay until you decide what comes next." Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope, but something warmer than despair. May I feel your face? So I know who I'm speaking to?" A pause, then her father said, "He's nodding." Thomas moved closer, and Charlotte raised her hands tentatively. Her fingers found a face that was weathered but not old, maybe 35, she guessed. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, hair that was thick and slightly longer than fashion dictated. His skin was warm and bore the small scars that came from working with fire and metal. When her fingertips touched the corners of his mouth, she felt him smile. Just slightly, but genuinely. "You have a kind face," she said softly, lowering her hands. "And gentle eyes." She felt him take her hand briefly, squeezing it in what seemed like gratitude for the compliment. "Papa," Charlotte said, turning toward her father, "what does this place look like?" George Miller was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte could almost feel him gathering his thoughts, fighting through the fog that too often clouded his mind these days. "It's beautiful, Charlotte," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "We're high up on the mountainside. I can see the whole valley below us, and Cedar Falls looks like a toy town from here. The cabin is built from logs, but it's not rough. Everything is fitted perfectly, like a master carpenter built it. There's a workshop separate from the house, with a forge and anvil. And gardens, Charlotte. Vegetable gardens that are still producing, even this late in the season." Charlotte could hear the wonder in her father's voice, and something else, a clarity that had been missing for weeks. Perhaps the shock of the fire or the change of environment had somehow cut through the confusion that had been overwhelming. Him more scratching, then her father reading, "I built this place myself. It took 3 years. I wanted somewhere peaceful, away from the noise of town." "You live here alone?" Charlotte asked. "Yes, I have for 8 years, since my accident." Charlotte hesitated, then asked, "What kind of accident?" The pencil was quiet. For a long time, then her father's voice, reading more slowly, "An explosion at the foundry where I worked. Lost my hearing and most of my voice. The foundry owner said it was my fault for being careless. No job, no compensation. I came here to start over." The words carried weight that Charlotte could feel even second-hand through her father's reading. Here was a man who understood loss, who had rebuilt his life from nothing, who had chosen isolation not from misanthropy, but from necessity. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "That must have been terrifying." More writing. "It was. But I learned that sometimes losing one thing helps you find something better. Here I can work at my own pace, create what I want to create, and live honestly." Charlotte nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. "People often assume that because I can't see, I can't do things. They want to help in ways that actually make me helpless." "Yes," her father read. "People stare at me when I cannot answer their questions quickly enough. They assume I am simple because I cannot hear. Here no one assumes anything about me." A comfortable silence settled over them. Charlotte could hear birds singing in the trees around the cabin, the distant sound of water running over rocks, and underneath it all, the whisper of wind through pine needles. The air was clean and cool, carrying none of the smoke and dust of town life. "Thomas," she said eventually, "you said we could stay until we decide what comes next, but we don't have anything to offer in return. No money, no possessions, no way to contribute." The scratching was immediate and firm. "You assume I need payment for doing what is right. I do not." Charlotte felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to offend you. It's just we're not accustomed to charity." "This is not charity," her father read, his voice carrying the weight of Thomas's certainty. "This is neighbors, helping neighbors. This is people caring for people. If you want to contribute, there are ways to help that do not require money, such as, your father knows how to bake. I trade with people in the valley for supplies. They bring me grain and flour. I make them tools and horseshoes. But I do not know how to turn grain into bread. And you move through spaces like someone who understands how to organize and manage. My cabin could use a woman's touch." Charlotte felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in days, usefulness. The prospect of having a purpose again, of being needed rather than merely pitied. "Papa," she said, "what do you think? Could you teach Thomas to bake? Could we help him with his household?" George Miller was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte held her breath, hoping the clarity would hold, that her father's mind would remain present and engaged. "I think," her father said slowly, "that Thomas has given us more than shelter. He's given us a chance to be useful again. Yes, Charlotte, I think we can help." More writing, and her father's voice carried a note of warmth as he read. "Then we have an agreement. You help me, I help you, and we see what grows from there." Charlotte smiled. The first genuine smile she'd managed since the fire. "Mr. Brennan, you have yourself a deal." The scratching was quick, almost playful. "Thomas, Justin Thomas. We will be neighbors, not strangers." As if to punctuate the agreement, a bell rang somewhere in the distance, clear and melodious, echoing across the mountainside. "What's that?" Charlotte asked. "Church bell," her father answered. "From the valley. It's Sunday morning." Charlotte realized she had lost track of time entirely. The fire had been on Friday morning. She'd been unconscious for 2 days, and now it was Sunday. The rhythm of her life, the early morning baking, the parade of familiar customers, the comfortable routine of the shop, was gone, replaced by something entirely unknown. But for the first time since waking up in this strange place, the unknown didn't feel frightening. It felt like a possibility. "Thomas," she said, "would you show me around? Help me learn the layout of this place?" The pencil scratched briefly, then her father read, "It would be my pleasure." And so began Charlotte Miller's introduction to a life she had never imagined. A life where morning silence was broken by the ring of hammer on anvil rather than the bustle of customers, where the air smelled of pine and wood smoke rather than yeast and flour, where a man who could not speak had somehow managed to say more about kindness and generosity than most people managed with a lifetime of words. As Thomas guided her around the cabin, his large hand steady on her arm, Charlotte began to understand that sometimes salvation came not in the form you expected, but in exactly the form you needed. The first week at Thomas's cabin passed like a dream wrapped in routine. Charlotte discovered that her hands, so accustomed to reading the world through touch, adapted quickly to new geography. The kitchen held a large stone hearth with a bread oven built into the chimney, not as sophisticated as the commercial ovens at Miller's bakery, but perfectly functional for a household. Thomas had arranged his supplies with the methodical precision of someone who relied on consistency: flour in sealed wooden barrels, salt in glass jars, dried herbs hanging from the rafters in neat bundles. Her father seemed to grow stronger each day, as if the mountain air was clearing not just his lungs, but his mind. He moved through the kitchen with increasing confidence, his hands rediscovering the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into sustenance. On Wednesday morning, Charlotte woke to the familiar aroma of rising bread dough, and for a moment she could almost pretend their old life hadn't ended in smoke and flame. "Papa," she called softly, padding barefoot across the wooden floors toward the kitchen. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," George Miller replied, but his voice carried contentment rather than distress. "Thought I'd surprise Thomas with fresh loaves for breakfast. Been too long since I had a proper oven to work with." Charlotte followed the warmth radiating from the hearth and found her father kneading dough with the rhythm she remembered from her childhood: steady, patient, meditative. "How does the oven compare to ours?" "Different, but good. Hold heat well and bake evenly. Thomas built it himself, and he built it right." Her father's voice carried professional respect. "Takes a different kind of intelligence to understand how fire and stone work together." Through the kitchen window, Charlotte could hear the distant ring of hammer on anvil. Thomas had been working since before dawn, as was his habit. She had learned to read the tempo of his strikes, quick and light for delicate work, slow and heavy when he was shaping something substantial. This morning the rhythm was contemplative, the sound of someone working through a problem with his hands. "I want to learn more about him," Charlotte said, settling onto a stool beside her father. "He's done so much for us, but we barely know who he is." George Miller was quiet for a moment, his hands never pausing in their work. "Yesterday, while you were hanging laundry, he showed me some of his pieces. Not just horseshoes and farm tools, Charlotte. Art, beautiful metalwork, candlesticks that look like flowering vines, hinges decorated with leaves and birds. The man has a gift." Charlotte tilted her head toward the window, listening to the forge song. "What else did you learn?" "He's been alone up here longer than he first told us. More than 8 years. Closer to 10, I think." Her father's voice dropped. "There was a woman once, before his accident. She left when he couldn't hear anymore, couldn't speak. Said she couldn't be tied to a man who couldn't provide for her properly." Charlotte felt a stab of anger on Thomas's behalf. "How do you know all this?" He showed me a photograph. Young woman, pretty, posed in a studio dress. But when he pointed to it, his expression, George Miller sighed. "Some wounds don't heal clean, Charlotte. They leave scars that go deeper than skin." The hammering outside stopped abruptly, and Charlotte heard Thomas's heavy footsteps approaching the cabin. Her father quickly shaped the dough into loaves and slid them into the oven. "Morning, Thomas," George called as the door opened. "Fresh bread will be ready within the hour." Charlotte heard the scratch of pencil on paper, then her father reading, "Smells like heaven. Thank you both." "Thomas," Charlotte said, turning toward where she sensed him standing. "Papa told me you showed him some of your metalwork. Would you let me feel some of your pieces? I'd love to understand what you create." A pause, then more writing. "Most people think blacksmith work is just hammering iron into horseshoes. You might be disappointed," Charlotte smiled. "Most people think baker's work is just mixing flour and water, but we know better, don't we?" She heard what might have been a quiet laugh, then Thomas's footsteps moving toward a corner of the kitchen. When he returned, he placed something in her hands, metal, but unlike any metalwork she had encountered before. Her fingers explored the piece slowly, carefully. It was a candlestick, but one that seemed to grow rather than being manufactured. The base was solid and substantial, but from it rose a stem that curved and twisted like a real plant. Leaves seemed to sprout from the metal stem, each one individually crafted with veins and texture that felt impossibly lifelike. At the top, where the candle would sit, metal petals formed a flower that could hold the wax as it dripped. "Thomas," she breathed, "this is extraordinary. How do you make metal feel so alive?" More scratching, then her father's voice, "Fire and patience. Metal wants to flow like water when it is hot enough. I just help it find the shape it wants to become." Charlotte continued exploring the candlestick, amazed by the detailed work. "This must take weeks to complete. This piece took 2 months. I work on art between commissions, something beautiful to balance all the practical work. Do you sell these pieces?" A longer pause then. "I used to try. But people in Cedar Falls want horseshoes and wagon repairs, not art. They think decorative metalwork is frivolous." Charlotte felt a familiar frustration on his behalf. People so often failed to recognize skill and beauty when it didn't fit their narrow expectations. "Have you ever taken your work to Denver or Colorado Springs, larger cities where people might appreciate craftsmanship?" "Once. A shop owner looked at my pieces and said they were rustic and quaint, but not sophisticated enough for his clientele." The pencil scratched more vigorously. "He said my work looked like it belonged in a frontier cabin, not a proper home." "What an idiot," Charlotte said with feeling, then immediately blushed. "I'm sorry, that was unladylike." She heard her father chuckle and felt Thomas's hand briefly touch her shoulder, a gesture that seemed to say her indignation was appreciated. "Thomas," She said more thoughtfully, "What if the problem isn't your work, but how it's being presented? What if people need to understand the story behind the pieces before they can appreciate them?" More writing. "What do you mean?" Charlotte set the candlestick down carefully and turned toward where she sensed Thomas sitting. "When people come to a bakery, they're not just buying bread. They're buying the comfort of home, the warmth of family, the security of daily sustenance. Papa doesn't just sell loaves. He sells the promise that families will gather around tables and share meals together." She could feel both men listening intently. "Your metalwork isn't just decorative. She searched for the right words. "It's permanent. It's the promise that beautiful things can endure, that someone cares enough to create something that will outlast them. People don't just want horseshoes, Thomas. They want heirlooms." The pencil was quiet for a long time. Then, "I never thought of it that way. Maybe," Charlotte continued, warming to her theme, "the right customers aren't the people who need practical metalwork. Maybe they're the people who are building homes and want pieces that will become family treasures. Young couples setting up households. Families with means who understand that quality costs more but lasts generations." "How would I find such customers?" Charlotte smiled. "The same way Papa built his bakery's reputation, word of mouth. One satisfied customer tells friends, who tell their friends. You create one perfect piece for the right person, and they become your advocate." Her father's voice joined the conversation. "Charlotte's right, Thomas. My best customers were the ones who understood the difference between bread and real bread. They paid more gladly because they knew the value of what they were getting. More scratching then. But my accident. I cannot travel to sell my work. Cannot speak to customers about what I create." "You don't need to speak," Charlotte said firmly. "Your work speaks for itself. And if customers want to understand the artist behind the pieces, you have other ways to communicate." She stood up and moved toward where she remembered seeing a small writing desk. Her fingers found paper and a pencil, and she returned to the table. "Tell me about this candlestick," she said. "Not just how you made it, but why. What inspired the design?" Thomas took the pencil and paper. After a few minutes, her father began reading. "I made this piece during my second winter here. The isolation was difficult, and I was struggling with despair. One morning, I found ice formations on the cabin windows that looked like flowers, beautiful and delicate, but formed by harsh conditions. I realized that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult circumstances. The candlestick is meant to remind people that light and beauty can flourish even in dark times." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, that's beautiful, and that story, that's what people need to hear. When they understand the heart behind the work, they're not just buying metal, they're buying hope." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The bread was filling the room with its warm, yeasty aroma, and Charlotte could feel something shifting in the space between the three of them, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. "There's something else," Charlotte said quietly. "Something I need to tell you both." She took a deep breath, gathering courage for a confession she had never made to anyone. "Before the fire, I was planning to leave Cedar Falls." Her father's hands were still in their work. "Charlotte? Not permanently," she said quickly, "but I had been saving money, planning to travel to Denver or even San Francisco. I wanted to prove that a blind woman could make her own way in the world and could be more than just the baker's daughter who helped in the family shop." George Miller's voice was soft with surprise. "You never said anything." "Because I knew you needed me. Your memory has been getting worse, Papa, and I couldn't abandon you, but I felt—" She struggled to find words that wouldn't hurt him. "I felt like I was disappearing, like every day I was becoming smaller, more confined to what other people thought I could do." Thomas's pencil moved across paper, and her father read, "What changed your mind about leaving?" Charlotte turned toward Thomas, even though she couldn't see him. The fire changed everything. It showed me that plans and safety and the comfortable known world can disappear in minutes. But it also brought us here, to you, to this place where being different isn't seen as being less. She reached out tentatively and felt Thomas's hand meet hers. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about what you said about sometimes losing one thing helps you find something better. Maybe the fire wasn't just destruction. Maybe it was also liberation." "From what?" her father asked gently. "From the assumption that we had to rebuild our old life exactly as it was. Maybe we can build something different, something better." Charlotte's voice grew stronger with conviction. "Thomas, you need help marketing your art, connecting with the right customers. Papa, you need a place where your mind can be clear and your skills can be valued. And I need to prove that I can contribute to something larger than myself." The pencil scratched rapidly. Then her father read, "Are you suggesting a partnership?" "I'm suggesting a family," Charlotte said simply. "Not by blood, but by choice. People who support each other's dreams instead of limiting them." Thomas's hand squeezed hers gently, and she felt her father's calloused palm cover both their hands. "The three of us," George Miller said wonderingly, "making a life together." "If you'll have us," Charlotte said to Thomas, "if you're willing to share not just your cabin, but your future." The pencil moved quickly across paper, and her father's voice carried a smile as he read, "I have been alone for 10 years. I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than myself. Yes, Charlotte Miller, I will share my future with you, with both of you." Outside, the church bell from the valley began its Sunday morning call to worship, the sound echoing across the mountainside like a blessing. Inside the cabin, 3 people who had lost everything began to imagine what they might build together from the ashes of their separate sorrows. The bread was ready. October brought the first heavy frost to the mountains, painting the aspen leaves gold and crimson against the dark green of the pines. Charlotte woke each morning to the sound of ice crackling in the water basin, and she found herself looking forward to the ritual of starting the day, stoking the fire, preparing coffee, listening for the first strikes of Thomas's hammer as he began his work in the forge. 3 weeks had passed since their conversation about partnership, and the rhythm of their shared life had settled into something that felt both comfortable and purposeful. Charlotte had taken over the household management with an efficiency that surprised even her. Without the familiar landmarks of the bakery to guide her, she had been forced to develop new systems, new ways of organizing space and time that worked for 3 people with different needs and abilities. The cabin's main room had been transformed into a workspace where she could pursue the plan that had been growing in her mind since that first conversation about Thomas's art. She had convinced him to bring several of his finished pieces into the house, and she spent hours each day exploring them with her fingertips, learning to understand his style and craftsmanship in ways that went beyond mere appreciation. "Thomas," she called toward the forge one crisp Tuesday morning, "could you come inside for a moment? I want to show you something." The hammering stopped, and soon she heard his familiar footsteps on the porch. When he entered, she gestured toward the table where she had arranged paper, pencils, and something else, a small wooden box that had survived the fire. "I've been working on something," she said, opening the box to reveal a collection of carefully folded papers. "Letters, descriptions of your work written for people who haven't seen it yet." Thomas approached the table, and she heard him settling into a chair across from her. "Listen to this," Charlotte said, unfolding one of the papers and beginning to read aloud. "The meadowlark candlestick represents more than illumination. It embodies the transformation of raw mountain iron into delicate beauty. Each petal has been individually forged and shaped, creating shadows that dance across walls like living flowers when candles are lit. This piece speaks to the enduring strength found in nature's most fragile moments. She looked up, toward where she sensed Thomas sitting. "What do you think?" The pencil scratched across paper, then Charlotte waited while Thomas wrote his response. "May I read what you've written?" she asked. Thomas placed the paper in her hands, and her fingers moved across the words he had written in his careful script. She had been teaching herself to read his handwriting by touch, and though it was slow work, she was becoming proficient. "You make my work sound more important than it is," she read aloud, "but the words are beautiful. How did you learn to write like this?" Charlotte smiled. "Before the fire, I used to help Papa write advertisements for the bakery. I learned that people don't just buy products. They buy stories, dreams, the promise of how something will make their lives better." She pulled out another letter. "This one is for the set of fireplace tools you finished last month, crafted from iron mined in the Colorado Rockies. These fireplace implements transform the necessity of tending fire into an act of artistry. The handles curve like branches, while the working ends maintain the strength required for their purpose. Functional sculpture for the home that honors both beauty and utility." Thomas was writing again, and when Charlotte read his response, she heard a surprise in her own voice. "These letters, are they for customers who might buy my work?" "Exactly, but not just any customers." Charlotte leaned forward, her voice growing more animated. "I've been thinking about what we discussed, finding the right people who will appreciate what you create. I want to send these letters to specific people in Denver and Colorado Springs." "What specific people?" Charlotte reached for another paper, this one covered with her own careful notes. "I spent 2 days in town last week, talking to Mrs. Henderson at the post office and Mr. Walsh at the bank. They helped me identify families who might be interested in commissioning custom pieces." Thomas's pencil remained still, waiting for her to continue. "The Morrison family just built a new house on Capitol Hill in Denver. They have money, they're establishing a household, and Mrs. Morrison is known for entertaining. She would understand the value of unique serving pieces." Charlotte's finger traced down her list. "The Carpenter family in Colorado Springs is building a mountain retreat. They're looking for furnishings that reflect the Colorado landscape." "You researched all of this?" Papa helped. His memory is much clearer when he has specific tasks to focus on. We made quite a team. Charlotte smiled fondly toward the kitchen, where her father was preparing their midday meal. "But here's the important part, Thomas. I don't want to just send letters describing your existing work. I want to offer custom commissions." The pencil scratched more urgently. "Custom work? But how would I know what they want if I cannot speak with them?" Charlotte had been anticipating this concern, the same way we've been communicating, through letters, through drawings, through detailed descriptions. In fact, written communication might be an advantage. Everything gets documented clearly, with no misunderstandings. She pulled out a folder that had been hidden beneath the other papers. "I've already received a response." Thomas's sharp intake of breath was audible, even though he made no other sound. Mrs. Morrison wrote back. "She's interested in commissioning a set of serving pieces for her dining room. Bowls, platters, decorative elements that incorporate natural motifs from the Rocky Mountains. She wants to meet with you, with us, to discuss the project." The silence stretched long enough that Charlotte began to worry she had overstepped, pushed too hard, too fast. Finally, the pencil began moving across paper, and Charlotte waited patiently, while Thomas wrote what seemed like a lengthy response. "May I read it?" she asked gently. He placed the paper in her hands, and she traced the words slowly. "No one has ever believed in my work the way you do. No one has ever worked so hard to help me succeed. I am afraid to hope that this might actually work, but I am more afraid of not trying. Yes, Charlotte, let us meet with Mrs. Morrison." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, there's something else, something I haven't told you yet." "What?" I've been learning about business, real business, not just helping Papa with the bakery accounts. Mrs. Henderson gave me some books about commerce and marketing. I think we could build something significant here, not just selling individual pieces, but creating a reputation, a brand that people seek out. Thomas was writing again. What would you call it? This business we might build? Charlotte had been pondering this question for days. Brennan Mountain Metalworks, she said simply, with the subtitle Heirloom Ironwork, crafted in the Colorado Rockies. And your role in Brennan Mountain Metalworks? Charlotte hesitated, then spoke with more confidence than she felt. Partner, full partner. I handle correspondence, customer relations, and business development. You create art. We build something together that neither of us could achieve alone. The kitchen door opened, and George Miller appeared with a tray of sandwiches and coffee. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said, setting the tray on the table beside Charlotte's papers. "Papa, perfect timing. We were just discussing the business plan." Charlotte gestured toward the papers scattered across the table. "Thomas has agreed to meet with Mrs. Morrison about a commission." George Miller settled into a chair with a satisfied grunt. "About time. I've been watching him create masterpieces and hide them in his workshop like they were secrets. Art is meant to be seen, appreciated, owned by people who understand its value." Thomas wrote quickly, then slid the paper toward George, who read aloud, "I'm nervous about meeting with wealthy customers. What if they think I'm not sophisticated enough?" Charlotte reached across the table and found Thomas's hand. "You are one of the most sophisticated people I've ever met. You just express it through iron and fire, instead of fancy words." "She's right," George added. "Besides, Charlotte will handle the talking. You just need to show them your work and let them see the passion in your eyes when you discuss your craft." "There's one more thing," Charlotte said, squeezing Thomas's hand gently. "The meeting with Mrs. Morrison is scheduled for next Tuesday in Denver." She felt Thomas's hand tense slightly. "I know it means leaving the mountain, being around people again. But Thomas, this is how we build a future. One customer at a time, one commission at a time." The pencil moved across paper. "Will you come with me to the meeting?" "Of course. We're partners, remember? Besides, I'm the one who wrote the letters. Mrs. Morrison is expecting to meet both of us." Thomas wrote again. "What if I cannot make her understand what I want to create? What if my attempts to communicate frustrate her?" Charlotte had been thinking about this challenge as well. "We'll prepare, we'll practice, and Thomas, you have something that most artists don't have." "What?" "You have me. Someone who believes in your work completely, who can translate your vision into words that others can understand." Charlotte's voice grew stronger with conviction. "Mrs. Morrison isn't just buying metalwork from you. She's buying a partnership, your artistry combined with my business skills. That's something unique, something valuable." George Miller had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Charlotte's mother used to say that the best partnerships weren't just about dividing up tasks. They were about each person becoming more than they could be alone. Charlotte felt a warm glow at her father's words. His clarity had been more consistent lately, and moments like this reminded her of the wise, thoughtful man he had always been. Beneath the confusion that sometimes clouded his mind, Thomas was writing again, and when he finished, he placed the paper in Charlotte's hands with what felt like a ceremony. She traced the words slowly, then read aloud. "I have been hiding from the world for 10 years. I convinced myself it was because the world did not want what I had to offer. But maybe I was just afraid of being rejected again. You are giving me courage to try again, Charlotte, to believe that my work matters." "Thank you." Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. "We're giving each other courage, Thomas. That's what partnerships do." She stood up and moved to the window, feeling the weak autumn sunlight on her face. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow from higher elevations. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said, turning back toward the table. "If this business succeeds, if we start getting regular commissions, we'll need to expand. Not just the workshop, but our capabilities." "What do you mean?" George asked. "Thomas creates beautiful individual pieces, but wealthy customers often want sets, complete services, matching elements for entire rooms. We'll need help, apprentices perhaps, people who can handle the simpler work while Thomas focuses on the artistic elements." Thomas wrote quickly, "I have never taught anyone. I work alone." "That would change," Charlotte acknowledged. "But Thomas, imagine what you could accomplish with skilled helpers handling the basic work. You could focus entirely on design and finishing, on the details that make your pieces special." She moved back to the table and found her folder of notes. "I've been thinking about this systematically. Year 1, we established our reputation with individual customers like Mrs. Morrison. Year 2, we expand the workshop and bring in an apprentice. Year 3, we're creating complete household collections for wealthy families throughout Colorado." "And year 4?" George asked, clearly intrigued by his daughter's vision. Charlotte smiled. "Year 4, Brennan Mountain Metalworks has a reputation that extends beyond Colorado. We're creating heirloom pieces for families who pass our work down through generations." Thomas was writing furiously, and when he finished, he slid the paper to George to read aloud. "You are describing a dream I never dared to have, a legacy that would outlast my lifetime. But Charlotte, what about your dreams? What about your desire to see the world, to prove your independence?" Charlotte reached for Thomas's hand again, holding it firmly. "I'm beginning to understand that independence doesn't mean doing everything alone. Sometimes the most independent thing you can do is choose the right people to build a life with." The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting golden light across the papers scattered on the table, letters to potential customers, business plans, sketches of metalwork designs, the foundation of something that none of them had imagined possible just a month ago. "So," Charlotte said, looking toward where she sensed both men sitting, "are we really doing this? Are we really going to Denver next Tuesday to meet with Mrs. Morrison?" Thomas wrote one final note and placed it in her hands. Charlotte traced the words with her fingertip, then smiled as she read them aloud. "We are going to change our lives together." The journey to Denver began before dawn on a Tuesday morning that promised rain. Thomas had barely slept, his nervousness evident in the way he moved around the cabin, checking and rechecking the leather portfolio that held samples of his work, adjusting the straps on the traveling case that protected his most delicate pieces, writing and rewriting the notes he planned to share with Mrs. Morrison. Charlotte had packed with the methodical precision of someone who understood that first impressions mattered immensely. Her best dress, carefully mended after the fire, lay wrapped in tissue paper. She had spent hours the night before polishing Thomas's sample pieces until they gleamed, arranging them in the presentation case with an eye toward showing his range. "And skill. Papa," Charlotte said as they prepared to leave, "are you certain you'll be all right alone for 2 days?" George Miller waved away her concerns with more confidence than he'd shown in months. "I got enough bread baked to last a week, the fire's laid for evening, and Mrs. Patterson promised to check on me this afternoon." He moved to embrace his daughter. "You focus on making Thomas's dreams come true. I'll be here when you get back, probably with a pot of stew waiting." The ride to Denver took 6 hours in Thomas's sturdy wagon, pulled by his reliable draft horses, Magnus and Belle. Charlotte had never traveled so far from Cedar Falls, and she found herself cataloging every new sound and scent, the different quality of wind across open plains, the increasing rumble of train traffic as they approached the city, the gradual shift from mountain pine to prairie grass. Thomas drove with steady concentration, occasionally reaching over to touch Charlotte's hand when the road became particularly rough. They had developed their own language of touch over the past weeks, a gentle squeeze that meant reassurance, a brief pat that indicated attention was needed, a longer clasp that conveyed gratitude or affection. "Thomas," Charlotte said as they crested a hill that overlooked the sprawling city below, "tell me what you see." He pulled the wagon to a stop and reached for his ever-present paper and pencil. After writing for several minutes, he placed the paper in her hands. Charlotte traced his words slowly. Buildings, taller than trees. Smoke from 100 chimneys. Streets full of carriages and people moving faster than mountain folk ever move. Everything looks rushed, important, intimidating. "Are you having second thoughts?" Charlotte asked gently. "More writing?" "Yes, but I am more afraid of not trying than I am of failing." Charlotte squeezed his hand. "That's exactly the right attitude. Mrs. Morrison chose to meet with us, Thomas. She's already interested. We just need to show her that her instincts were correct." They reached the city proper by early afternoon, and Thomas navigated the busy streets with the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to urban chaos. The Morrison mansion sat on Capitol Hill, an imposing three-story structure built from red sandstone with elaborate ironwork decorating the front gates and balconies. "Thomas," Charlotte whispered as they approached the front entrance, "describe the ironwork on the house." He wrote quickly, "Mass-produced, geometric patterns, no imagination. Functional but cold. Your work would make this house warm." Charlotte smiled. "Perfect. Remember that feeling when we're inside." Mrs. Morrison proved to be a woman in her 40s with prematurely silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt her own judgment. She received them in a parlor that showcased her appreciation for fine craftsmanship, Persian rugs, oil paintings in elaborate frames, furniture that had clearly been chosen for both beauty and quality. "Miss Miller," Mrs. Morrison said, settling into a velvet armchair, "your letters were most intriguing, and Mr. Brennan, I understand you prefer to communicate through writing?" Thomas nodded, and immediately began writing on the tablet he had prepared specifically for this meeting. When he finished, he handed the paper to Mrs. Morrison, who read aloud, "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I lost my hearing in an industrial accident, but my hands remember everything about shaping metal. I am honored that you might consider commissioning my work." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened noticeably. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate directness. Now, Miss Miller described your work as heirloom ironwork. I must confess I was skeptical. So much of what passes for artistry these days is merely decoration without substance." Charlotte opened their presentation case with careful ceremony. "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps you'd like to examine some examples before we discuss your specific needs." She lifted out the meadowlark candlestick that had first revealed Thomas's artistic vision to her. Mrs. Morrison accepted it with the careful attention of someone accustomed to handling valuable objects. The woman was quiet for a long moment, turning the piece in her hands, examining the detailed metalwork from every angle. When she looked up, her expression had changed completely. "This is extraordinary," she said simply. "The level of detail, the artistic vision. This isn't ironwork, Mr. Brennan. This is sculpture." Thomas wrote quickly, "Every piece tells a story. This one speaks of finding beauty in harsh conditions, of light that persists through darkness." "Yes," Mrs. Morrison murmured, still studying the candlestick. "I can see that. What else did you bring?" Charlotte revealed the fireplace tools, a decorative bowl that resembled a bird's nest, and a small mirror frame that incorporated mountain wildflowers into its design. Each piece demonstrated a different aspect of Thomas's skill and artistic vision. Mrs. Morrison examined every item with growing enthusiasm. "Miss Miller, your letters didn't exaggerate. This work is museum quality." She looked directly at Thomas. "I want to commission an entire dining room collection, serving pieces, decorative elements, perhaps even custom light fixtures." Can you create pieces that complement each other while maintaining this level of artistry? Thomas's hand was shaking slightly as he wrote his response. Yes, I would design everything to work together, like movements in a symphony, each piece individually but part of a larger composition. Excellent. Mrs. Morrison stood and moved to an ornate writing desk. Now, let's discuss practical matters. Timeline, cost, specific requirements. Charlotte felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. This was the crucial moment, the transition from artistic appreciation to business negotiation. Mrs. Morrison, Charlotte said carefully, before we discuss specifics, there's something you should understand about how we work. Oh? Thomas doesn't just create metalwork. He creates stories in metal. Each commission begins with understanding who you are, how you live, what you want your home to express about your family. Charlotte gestured toward the pieces displayed on Mrs. Morrison's coffee table. We don't make generic serving pieces. We make the Morrison family's serving pieces, unique to you, meaningful to your household. Mrs. Morrison returned to her chair, clearly intrigued. What would that process involve? Thomas wrote while Charlotte continued. Thomas would need to spend time here, observing how you entertain, understanding the flow of your dining room, learning about your personal style and preferences. He would need to spend time here? In Denver. Charlotte felt Thomas tense beside her. This was the moment she had been dreading, the practical complications of Thomas's disabilities in an urban environment. Thomas works best when he can understand his customers personally, Charlotte explained. But we recognize that might present challenges. Thomas is more comfortable in quieter environments where communication is easier. Mrs. Morrison looked thoughtful. Miss Miller, may I speak frankly? Of course. I have money. I have taste. What I don't have is access to truly original artistry. She gestured toward Thomas's pieces. This work is exactly what I've been searching for. Craftsmanship that will make my home distinctive, pieces that my grandchildren will treasure. Charlotte waited, sensing that Mrs. Morrison was building toward something important. I have a proposition, Mrs. Morrison continued. Rather than trying to adapt your mountain artist to city life, what if I adapted to your process? What do you mean? I have a summer home in Georgetown, about halfway between here and your mountain. It's smaller than this house, simpler, but it would provide a setting where Mr. Brennan could work comfortably while still creating pieces for my Denver dining room. Thomas wrote rapidly. You would come to the mountains? Not permanently, but for extended visits while you're working on my commission. I could observe your process, make suggestions, and ensure the pieces meet my needs. Mrs. Morrison smiled. Frankly, Mr. Brennan, I suspect I would learn as much from watching you work as you would from observing my entertaining style. Charlotte felt hope and relief flooding through her. This was better than anything she had dared to imagine, a customer who was willing to accommodate Thomas's needs rather than demanding that he conform to conventional business practices. But then Mrs. Morrison's expression grew more serious. However, there is one complication we need to address. Charlotte's stomach tightened. What kind of complication? Your reputation, Miss Miller, or rather, the lack of an established reputation for Brennan Mountain Metalworks. Mrs. Morrison moved back to her writing desk and retrieved a letter. I made some inquiries after receiving your correspondence. The responses were mixed. She handed the letter to Charlotte, who felt her blood chill as she traced the familiar handwriting. Mr. Harold Finch, the owner of Finch Metalworks here in Denver, was quite emphatic in his opinions about mountain craftsmen attempting to compete with established city businesses. Charlotte's hands were shaking as she continued reading the letter that clearly came from someone who viewed Thomas as a threat to his own business. He suggested that untrained mountain blacksmiths often promise more than they can deliver, that their work lacks the sophistication required for wealthy urban clients. Mrs. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. He offered to create my dining room collection at a significant discount to prevent me from making what he called an expensive mistake. Thomas reached for his tablet, but Charlotte could see his hands trembling as he tried to write. Furthermore, Mrs. Morrison continued, Mr. Finch indicated that he was familiar with your Mr. Brennan specifically. He said that Thomas Brennan was dismissed from his previous position for unreliability and dangerous work practices. Charlotte felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. This was exactly the kind of character assassination that could destroy their fledgling business before it even began. Thomas had stopped trying to write. His face was pale, and Charlotte could sense his old fears rushing back. The certainty that he would be rejected, that his disabilities made him unemployable, that he was foolish to believe he could compete in a world that had already judged him inadequate. Mrs. Morrison, Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt, Mr. Finch is misinformed about the circumstances of Thomas's accident. Oh, Charlotte reached for Thomas's hand, feeling his fingers cold and rigid with distress. Thomas wasn't dismissed for unreliability. He was injured in an industrial accident caused by his employer's negligence. When he lost his hearing, the foundry owner blamed him to avoid paying compensation. She turned toward Thomas, speaking directly to him, even though she knew Mrs. Morrison was listening. Thomas, we knew this might happen. We knew that someone might try to undermine our reputation before we had a chance to establish it. Thomas finally managed to write, his letters shaky but legible. Maybe Mr. Finch is right. Maybe I'm not qualified for this kind of work. No, Charlotte said firmly. Mr. Finch is afraid. He's afraid that customers will see the difference between mass-produced metalwork and true artistry. He's afraid that once people experience your work, they'll never settle for him again. Mrs. Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Miss Miller, these are serious accusations on both sides. How do you suggest we resolve this conflict? Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Thomas's future, their future, resting on her next words. Let the work speak for itself, she said simply. Don't take Mr. Finch's word. Don't take our word. Commission one piece from Thomas, something small, something that will allow you to judge his skill and professionalism directly. And if the easy piece doesn't meet my standards, then you pay nothing, and we accept that Mr. Finch was correct. Charlotte's voice grew stronger with conviction. But if Thomas's work exceeds your expectations, if it demonstrates the level of artistry and craftsmanship we've promised, then we proceed with the full commission. Mrs. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the pieces still displayed. On her coffee table, Miss Miller, she said finally, that's either the confidence of someone who believes completely in her partner's abilities, or the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. Charlotte smiled, feeling Thomas's hand squeeze hers. Sometimes those are the same thing, Mrs. Morrison. Sometimes complete confidence comes from having already lost everything and discovering that you still have each other. Mrs. Morrison returned her smile. Mr. Brennan, can you create a single serving piece, perhaps a centerpiece bowl, that incorporates the mountain motifs we discussed while demonstrating your ability to work at the sophistication level my dining room requires? Thomas wrote slowly but steadily, Yes, I will create something that proves Mr. Finch wrong about mountain craftsmanship. When would you like to see it? 2 weeks, Mrs. Morrison said decisively. Bring me one piece that justifies my faith in you, and we'll proceed with the full commission. As they loaded their samples back into the traveling case, Charlotte felt the weight of everything that depended on the next 2 weeks. Thomas's artistic future, their business partnership, their chosen family's financial security, all of it would be determined by a single piece of metalwork. But as they walked back to their wagon through the busy Denver streets, Charlotte realized that her strongest feeling wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Thomas was about to prove what she had known from the moment her fingers first explored his candlestick, that true artistry couldn't be diminished by lies or prejudice or fear. The mountain was calling them home, and they had work to do. The ride back to the mountains was quieter than their journey to Denver. Thomas drove with mechanical precision, his jaw set in determination, while Charlotte sat beside him wrestling with doubts she couldn't voice. 2 weeks to create a masterpiece that would either launch their dreams or confirm their critics' worst assumptions about mountain craftsmen who dared to reach beyond their station. As they climbed the winding road toward home, Charlotte finally broke the silence. "Thomas, talk to me. What are you thinking?" He handed her the reins without slowing the horses and reached for his writing tablet. When he placed the paper in her hands, Charlotte traced words that made her heart ache. "I keep hearing Mr. Finch's voice in my head, saying I am not qualified for sophisticated work. What if he is right? What if I create something crude that embarrasses us both?" Charlotte folded the paper carefully before responding. "Thomas, do you remember what you told me about your candlestick, about how beauty can grow from harsh conditions?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. Mr. Finch represents the harsh conditions. His doubt, his prejudice, his fear. That's the ace you have to work through to create something beautiful. Charlotte turned toward him. "But here's what Mr. Finch doesn't understand. He's never had to prove himself the way you have. He's never had to communicate entire conversations through metal and fire. You've been preparing for this challenge your whole life." Thomas took back the reins and wrote another note. "What if Mrs. Morrison changes her mind? What if Mr. Finch convinces her not to risk working with unknown mountain artisans? Then we'll find other customers," Charlotte said firmly. "Mrs. Morrison isn't the only person in Colorado who appreciates true craftsmanship, but Thomas, I don't think she's going to change her mind. Did you see how she looked at your work? That wasn't polite interest, that was recognition." When they finally reached the cabin, George Miller was waiting on the porch with coffee and the kind of expectant expression that meant he'd been counting the hours until their return. "Well?" he called as they approached. "Did she appreciate what she saw?" "She wants to commission a full dining room collection," Charlotte replied, climbing down from the wagon. "But first Thomas has to create a test piece. 2 weeks to prove we're everything we claim to be." George Miller's face split into a grin. "A test piece? Son, you've been creating test pieces your whole life, every time you pick up a hammer. This is just the first time someone important enough to matter is going to see the result." Thomas unloaded their traveling cases while Charlotte explained the details of their meeting. Mrs. Morrison's enthusiasm, Harold Finch's interference, the compromise they'd reached about working from Georgetown. "So this Finch character thinks he can intimidate you into quitting before you start," George mused. "What kind of piece are you planning to create?" Thomas had been unusually quiet since their arrival, but now he moved purposefully toward his workshop. Charlotte and her father followed, stepping into the familiar space that smelled of coal and hot metal. Thomas lit a lantern and moved to a corner of the workshop, where he kept his most detailed sketches. He pulled out a drawing that Charlotte had never seen before, a design for a serving bowl that was breathtaking in its complexity. "May I feel this?" Charlotte asked, and Thomas guided her hands over the sketch. Her fingers traced the outline of a bowl that seemed to capture an entire mountain landscape. The base was designed to look like stone foundations, while the sides rose in curves that suggested rolling hills. Around the rim, delicate metalwork depicted pine trees, wildflowers, and soaring birds. But most remarkable was the center, a raised design that felt like a mountain peak emerging from the bowl's depths. "Thomas," Charlotte breathed, "this is incredible. When did you design this?" He wrote quickly. 3 years ago. I dreamed of creating a piece that would show city people what mountain beauty really looks like, but I never had a reason to actually make it." George Miller examined the sketch over Charlotte's shoulder. This isn't just a serving bowl, son. This is a poem written in metal. How long will it take to create? Charlotte asked. If I work every day, morning to night, I can finish it in 10 days. That leaves time for polishing and final details. Charlotte felt a surge of excitement mixed with determination. Then we have a plan. Thomas creates his masterpiece while I handle the correspondence and business details. But Thomas wrote another note, this one hesitant. Charlotte, what if my vision is too ambitious? What if I cannot execute what I have designed? Then you'll adapt, Charlotte said simply. Great artists don't create masterpieces by playing it. Safe, Thomas. They create them by reaching for something that scares them. The next morning, Thomas began work before dawn. Charlotte woke to the sound of his forge coming to life, the rhythm of hammer on anvil that had become the soundtrack of their mountain life. She made coffee and breakfast, then carried a tray to the workshop where she found Thomas deep in concentration, shaping what would become the bowl's foundation. Good morning, she called softly, not wanting to startle him while he worked with hot metal. Thomas looked up and smiled, gesturing for her to approach. He had already made remarkable progress. The basic bowl shape was emerging from the iron, rough but recognizable. Charlotte set the tray on his workbench and moved to where she could feel the heat radiating from the forge. Show me what you're doing. Thomas took her hand and guided it carefully above the still warm metal, letting her feel the shape he was creating. Even in its early stages, the bowl had a presence that spoke of something more than mere function. It's going to be beautiful, Charlotte said, and meant it. Thomas wrote a quick note. Come back this afternoon, I will have more to show you. Charlotte spent the morning updating their correspondence, writing letters to other potential customers, and researching metalwork markets in cities beyond Colorado. She had decided that regardless of Mrs. Morrison's decision, they would continue building Brennan Mountain Metalworks. This commission was important, but it wasn't their only opportunity. When she returned to the workshop after lunch, she found Thomas working on the detailed rim decorations. He had somehow managed to make iron look like delicate pine branches, each needle individually crafted, each branch positioned with the asymmetrical perfection of nature. Thomas, how do you make metal look so organic? He paused in his work and wrote, I do not fight the metal. I listen to what it wants to become, then guide it toward my vision. Force creates crude work. Patience creates art. Over the following days, Charlotte established a routine of bringing Thomas meals and observing his progress. She watched him create the mountain wildflowers that would encircle the bowl's rim, tiny metal blooms that seemed to sway in an unfelt breeze. She felt him shaping the soaring eagles that would perch among the pine branches, their wings spread in eternal flight. But the most remarkable element was the center peak that rose from the bowl's depths. Thomas had designed it to catch and reflect light, creating the illusion that snow-covered summits were glowing with alpine sunrise. When he finally allowed Charlotte to explore it with her fingertips, she gasped audibly, Thomas, this isn't just beautiful, it's miraculous. He wrote, It is the mountains as I see them, wild and powerful and eternal. Mrs. Morrison will hold our entire landscape in her hands. On the 8th day, disaster struck. Charlotte was in the cabin preparing lunch when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the sharp crack of metal breaking under stress. She ran toward the workshop, her heart pounding with dread. Thomas was standing at his workbench, staring down at 2 pieces of what had been the bowl's intricate rim decoration. A flaw in the metal, invisible until stressed by detailed work, had caused an entire section of pine branches and wildflowers to snap away from the main structure. Charlotte approached carefully, seeing the devastation in Thomas's posture. How bad is it? Thomas wrote with shaking hands, 8 days of work, ruined. I cannot recreate the rim detail in the time remaining. I have failed before I even had a chance to succeed. Charlotte moved to the workbench and felt the broken pieces, understanding immediately the scope of the problem. The fracture had destroyed not just the decorative elements, but had damaged the structural integrity of the rim itself. "Can you repair it?" she asked quietly. "Not in time. Not to the standard Mrs. Morrison expects." Thomas's shoulders sagged with defeat. Mr. Finch was right. I am not capable of sophisticated work under pressure. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, thinking furiously. Then she moved to Thomas's side and took his ink-stained hands in hers. "Thomas, listen to me. This isn't failure. This is an opportunity to prove something even more important than your artistic skill." He looked at her questioningly. "Mrs. Morrison doesn't just want a pretty serving bowl. She wants an artist who can solve problems, who can adapt when things go wrong, who can deliver exceptional work even under challenging circumstances." Charlotte's voice grew stronger with conviction. "Show her how a true craftsman responds to adversity." How? Charlotte had been studying the broken bowl, and an idea was forming in her mind. What if the break isn't a flaw to be hidden? What if it's a design element to be featured? Thomas stared at her as if she'd suggested he deliberately damage his work. "Think about it, Thomas. Mountains aren't perfect. They're shaped by earthquakes, avalanches, erosion, forces that break and reshape the landscape into something more beautiful than what existed before." Charlotte picked up one of the broken pieces. What if this crack becomes a canyon? What if the separation becomes a valley between peaks? Thomas wrote slowly, "You are suggesting I incorporate the damage into the design. I'm suggesting you transform the damage into artistry. Show Mrs. Morrison that a master craftsman doesn't just avoid problems. He turns problems into solutions that no one else could have imagined." Thomas studied the broken bowl for several minutes, his artist's eye beginning to see possibilities, where moments before he had seen only failure. Finally he wrote, "It would be unprecedented, risky. I have never heard of any metalworker deliberately featuring structural damage as a design element." "Exactly," Charlotte said with a smile. "It would be uniquely yours, something no other craftsman would have the vision or courage to attempt." Thomas picked up his hammer and looked at Charlotte with something that might have been hope. "If this works, it will be because you saw an opportunity where I saw only disaster. If this works," Charlotte corrected, "it will be because you have the skill and artistry to make the impossible look inevitable." For the next 4 days, Thomas worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Charlotte watched him transform the accidental break into an intentional design feature, a dramatic canyon that divided the mountain landscape, with delicate bridges of metalwork spanning the gap like natural stone arches. The result was breathtaking. What had been a beautiful but conventional serving bowl became something entirely unprecedented, a landscape in miniature that told the story of geological forces, natural destruction and renewal, the way broken things could become more beautiful than they had ever been whole. On the morning they were scheduled to return to Denver, Charlotte explored the finished piece one final time. Her fingers traced every detail: the pine forests, the wildflower meadows, the soaring eagles, and most remarkably the dramatic canyon that had been born from disaster and transformed into the bowl's most striking feature. "Thomas," she said, softly, "this is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced. Mrs. Morrison isn't just going to approve this commission. She's going to treasure this piece for the rest of her life." Thomas wrote his final note before they departed for Denver. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. You have given me the courage to believe in my own vision, Charlotte folded the note carefully and tucked it into her traveling case. In a few hours, they would know whether their partnership had a future, whether Thomas's artistry was enough to overcome prejudice and doubt, whether love and determination could triumph over fear and professional jealousy. But as they loaded the precious bowl into their wagon and began the journey back to the city, Charlotte realized that they had already won the most important victory. They had proven to themselves that together they could create something neither of them could have achieved alone. The second journey to Denver felt entirely different from their first tentative expedition 2 weeks earlier. Thomas drove with quiet confidence, the precious bowl secured. In a custom-built wooden case behind them, Charlotte sat beside him, no longer nervous about their reception, but rather eager to witness Mrs. Morrison's reaction to what they had created together. As they approached the Morrison mansion, Charlotte noticed something that made her smile. Thomas, there's a carriage already in the drive, quite an expensive one from the sound of the horses." Thomas pulled their wagon to a stop and wrote quickly, "Mr. Finch's carriage. He has come to witness what he expects will be our failure." "Perfect," Charlotte said with satisfaction. "He can watch us succeed." Mrs. Morrison received them in the same parlor as before, but this time she was not alone. A heavy-set man in an expensive suit sat rigidly in one of her chairs, his expression radiating skepticism and poorly concealed hostility. This had to be Harold Finch. "Miss Miller, Mr. Brennan," Mrs. Morrison said graciously. "Please meet Mr. Harold Finch of Finch Metalworks. He has graciously agreed to serve as an expert consultant in evaluating your work." Charlotte felt Thomas tense beside her, but she maintained her composure. "Mr. Finch, how kind of you to take time from your busy schedule to assist Mrs. Morrison." Finch's smile was cold and predatory. "I considered it my professional duty to prevent a valued customer from making a costly mistake. Mountain blacksmiths often promise far more than they can deliver." Thomas reached for his writing tablet, but Charlotte placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Finch, we prefer to let our work speak for itself. Mrs. Morrison, are you ready to see what Thomas has created?" Mrs. Morrison leaned forward with genuine anticipation. "I've been curious all week. Please, show me what 2 weeks of mountain craftsmanship can produce." Charlotte opened their traveling case with a deliberate ceremony, aware that both Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Finch were watching every movement. She lifted out the bowl slowly, feeling its perfect weight and balance, then placed it on the coffee table between them. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Morrison rose from her chair and approached the bowl with the careful attention of someone who recognized they were seeing something unprecedented. Her fingers traced the intricate metalwork, the pine forests that seemed to sway in an unfelt breeze, the wildflowers that looked as if they might release fragrance, the eagles, frozen in eternal flight above mountain peaks. "This is," she began, then stopped, apparently unable to find adequate words. Mr. Finch had also risen, but his expression was one of barely concealed shock rather than appreciation. He moved closer to examine the bowl, clearly searching for flaws he could criticize. "The central canyon," Mrs. Morrison said softly. "It's so dramatic, so realistic. How did you achieve this level of detail?" Thomas wrote quickly. "Sometimes the most beautiful features emerge from unexpected challenges. That canyon represents the power of natural forces to create something more beautiful than what existed before." Mrs. Morrison read his response aloud, then looked at him with new understanding. "You're not just a craftsman, Mr. Brennan. You're a philosopher." Mr. Finch finally spoke, his voice tight with professional jealousy. "It's certainly elaborate, but Mrs. Morrison, you must consider the practical aspects. This piece is far too ornate for actual use. The detailed work will make it nearly impossible to clean properly." Charlotte had been anticipating this criticism. Mr. Finch raises an interesting point about functionality. Mrs. Morrison, would you like to see how the bowl performs its intended purpose? She produced a linen cloth from their case and a small bottle of water. With careful movements, she demonstrated how the bowl's design actually enhanced its functionality. The mountain peak in the center created natural drainage, the rim channels guided liquid away from the decorative elements, and the seemingly delicate metalwork was actually engineered for durability. As you can see, Charlotte explained, Thomas didn't just create art, he created functional art. Every decorative element serves a practical purpose as well. Mrs. Morrison was examining the bowl even more closely now, clearly impressed by the integration of beauty and utility. The level of planning required. Mr. Brennan, how long have you been developing these techniques? Thomas wrote, 10 years of working alone taught me that every piece must justify its existence through both beauty and function. Mountain life demands that nothing be merely decorative. Mr. Finch was becoming visibly agitated. Mrs. Morrison, I must insist that you consider the source of this work. Mountain metalworkers lack the training and sophistication required for pieces of this supposed caliber. This bowl may look impressive, but I guarantee it won't withstand the kind of regular use you require. Charlotte felt her temper rise, but before she could respond, Mrs. Morrison spoke with quiet authority. Mr. Finch, I appreciate your concern, but I believe I'm capable of judging quality for myself. She lifted the bowl carefully, testing its weight and balance. This piece demonstrates a level of artistry and technical skill that I rarely encounter, even in established city workshops. But Mrs. Morrison, furthermore, she continued, her voice growing firmer, I find your persistent attempts to undermine these artisans rather unprofessional. Competition should be won through superior work, not through character assassination. Mr. Finch's face flushed red. I am simply trying to protect you from making a mistake that will reflect poorly on your judgment. Mrs. Morrison set the bowl down with decisive finality. Mr. Finch, the only mistake I might make today would be failing to recognize exceptional talent when it's presented to me. She turned to Charlotte and Thomas. I want to commission the full dining room collection. When can you begin? Charlotte felt her heart soar, but she maintained her professional composure. Mrs. Morrison, we're honored by your confidence in our work. We can begin immediately, but I want to ensure you understand our process completely. What do you mean? Thomas, we'll need to spend time in your Georgetown home, observing how you entertain, understanding the flow of your space. Each piece will be designed specifically for your household, not adapted from generic patterns. How long would the full collection take? Thomas wrote carefully. 6 months for 12 major pieces, each one designed to complement the others, while maintaining individual character. Every piece will be signed and dated, becoming part of your family's legacy. Mrs. Morrison was nodding enthusiastically. Exactly what I hoped for. And the cost? Charlotte named a figure that was 3 times what they had originally planned to. Request, a sum that would establish Brennan Mountain Metalworks as a luxury artisan business rather than a humble craft operation. Mrs. Morrison didn't even hesitate. Acceptable. I'll provide half the commission as advance payment, the remainder upon completion. Mr. Finch stood abruptly. Mrs. Morrison, you're making a serious error. When these mountain amateurs fail to deliver on their promises, don't expect Finch Metalworks to salvage the situation. Mr. Finch, Mrs. Morrison replied coolly, I won't be requiring your services. Please see yourself out. After Finch departed with obvious fury, Mrs. Morrison settled back into her chair with visible relief. I apologize for that unpleasant scene. Mr. Finch has been the established metalworker in Denver for years, and I suspect he views your emergence as a threat to his monopoly. Thomas wrote, We do not wish to make enemies. We simply want to create beautiful things for people who appreciate craftsmanship. Mr. Brennan, in my experience, doing exceptional work inevitably creates enemies among those who prefer mediocrity. Mrs. Morrison smiled warmly. I suggest you prepare for Mr. Finch to continue his efforts to undermine your reputation. Charlotte had been thinking about this possibility throughout their conversation. Mrs. Morrison, would you be willing to serve as a reference for future customers? Word-of-mouth recommendations will be crucial for establishing our reputation. More than willing. In fact, I intend to showcase your work at my Christmas entertaining season. Denver's social elite will see these pieces in use, and I suspect you'll receive more commissions than you can handle. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Morrison presented them with a contract that formalized their agreement and the advance payment that would fund the expansion of Thomas's workshop. There's one more thing, she said as they reached the door. I want you to know that commissioning your work isn't charity or social experimentation. It's an investment in artistry that I believe will appreciate significantly over time. The ride home was jubilant. Thomas drove with one hand while writing notes to Charlotte with the other, sharing his excitement about the workshop improvements. They could now afford the apprentice they might hire, the artistic possibilities that were suddenly within reach. Charlotte, he wrote during one of their stops, none of this would have happened without you. Your belief in my work, your business skills, your courage to reach beyond what seemed possible. Charlotte folded the note carefully. Thomas, we did this together. Your artistry combined with our partnership. That's what Mrs. Morrison was really commissioning, not just metalwork, but the unique collaboration we've created. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any artistic creation. George Miller was waiting on the porch, and his face split into a grin when he saw their expressions. Success, he called. Beyond our wildest dreams, Charlotte replied, climbing down from the wagon. Thomas has a 6-month commission that will establish our reputation throughout Colorado. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table planning the workshop expansion and discussing the logistics of splitting time between the mountain and Georgetown, Charlotte felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of their story, but the end of the beginning. The transition from survival to success, from hope to achievement. Papa, she said, what do you think Mama would say about all this? George Miller was quiet for a moment, his mind clear and present. Your mother always said that the best partnerships were built on each person bringing their greatest strengths, to serve something larger than themselves. He looked between Charlotte and Thomas. I think she would say, you've honored that principle beautifully. Thomas wrote a note and slid it across the table. George, will you help us design the workshop? Expansion? Your experience with functional construction would be invaluable. George Miller's eyes brightened. I'd be honored to contribute to Brennan Mountain Metalworks. Over the following weeks, their lives transformed with the same dramatic pace that had characterized everything since the fire. Thomas began work on Mrs. Morrison's dining collection, while Charlotte managed the business correspondence that was already flowing from Mrs. Morrison's social connections. The workshop expansion began with a new forge designed specifically for detailed artistry, separate from the utilitarian workspace where Thomas handled practical commissions. George Miller proved to be an invaluable construction supervisor, his architectural skills returning as his mind engaged with purposeful work. By November, they had hired their first apprentice, a young man named Samuel Crawford, who had lost his left arm in a mining accident but possessed remarkable dexterity with his remaining hand and an intuitive understanding of metalwork. Thomas discovered that teaching forced him to articulate his artistic philosophy in ways that deepened his own understanding of his craft. Charlotte established a correspondence network that extended beyond Colorado, reaching potential customers. In California, Texas, and even New York, She developed a catalogue system that allowed customers to commission pieces without requiring face-to-face meetings, using detailed written descriptions and Thomas's sketches to communicate artistic visions across great distances. But perhaps the most significant transformation was personal rather than professional. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, the cabin windows and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Thomas approached Charlotte with a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver locket, clearly handmade, engraved with the same mountain motifs that characterized his larger works. "Open it," he wrote, his handwriting betraying nervous excitement. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph, the three of them standing in front of the expanded workshop, with Samuel Crawford and Magnus and Belle visible in the background. Below, the photograph, engraved in Thomas's careful script, were the words, "Our chosen family." Charlotte felt tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Thomas, it's beautiful. But why?" He handed her another note, this one longer and more carefully. Composed, "Charlotte, when you collapsed at my door during the fire, I thought I was saving your life. I didn't realize you were saving mine. You taught me that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build with the right person, one day at a time, one choice at a time." Charlotte looked up at him, seeing the question in his eyes before he could write it. "Yes," she said simply. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes." Thomas wrote quickly, "Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything, not just business?" "I already am," Charlotte replied, reaching for his hands. "I have been since the moment you carried me to safety. I love you, Thomas Brennan. I love the man who speaks through metal and fire, who sees beauty in broken things, who builds homes out of hope." George Miller, who had been pretending to read in the corner, looked up with tears in his eyes. "Your mother would be so proud, Charlotte. You've built exactly the kind of life she always dreamed for you, one where love and work and purpose all grow together." They were married on New Year's Day 1893 in a simple ceremony at the cabin with Samuel Crawford and Mrs. Morrison as witnesses. Thomas had created their wedding rings himself, simple bands engraved with pine needles that wrapped around their fingers like promises of eternal growth. Mrs. Morrison's dining collection was completed in April and showcased at a dinner party that became legendary in Denver society. Within 6 months, Brennan Mountain Metalworks had a waiting list of customers that extended 2 years into the future. But success didn't change the fundamental rhythm of their lives. They still woke to the sound of hammer on anvil, still shared morning coffee while planning the day's work, still gathered around the kitchen table each evening to discuss challenges and celebrate small victories. Samuel Crawford became not just an apprentice but a son, learning not only metalwork but the principles of turning adversity into artistry. George Miller's mental clarity continued to improve as he found purpose in managing the business's practical operations. On their first wedding anniversary, Charlotte and Thomas stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset over the mountains that had sheltered their love story. "Do you ever miss the old life?" Charlotte asked. "The bakery, the predictable routine, the simple certainties." Thomas wrote thoughtfully, "I miss the bread your father made, but I do not miss the fear. I do not miss believing that broken things could never be beautiful again." Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had carried her from despair to joy. "I used to think independence meant doing everything alone. Now I understand that real independence is choosing the right people to build a life with." "And what kind of life are we building?" Charlotte smiled, placing her hand over her heart, where she could feel the gentle rhythm that would soon become a new heartbeat. "The kind where love creates art, where partnerships create possibilities, where broken people become whole families." Thomas's hand found hers, and together they watched the last light fade from the mountain peaks, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to transform raw materials into lasting beauty. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, the sound of progress, of connection, of a changing world that had made room for a deaf blacksmith and a blind businesswoman to build something unprecedented together. Inside the cabin, George Miller was teaching Samuel Crawford to play chess while dinner simmered on the stove. The workshop stood ready for tomorrow's work, filled with tools and materials and the promise of creations not yet imagined. And in the growing darkness, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled below them like earthbound stars, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary disasters. A fire, a rescue, a moment when strangers choose to become family. Their mountain had kept its promise. They were home. The spring of 1898 brought unprecedented prosperity to the mountains above Cedar Falls. Brennan Mountain Metalworks had evolved from a struggling partnership into the most sought-after artisan metalwork studio in the American West. Their reputation stretched from San Francisco to Chicago, with wealthy industrialists and established families commissioning entire household collections that bore Thomas's distinctive mountain motifs. Charlotte stood in the expanded showroom they had built adjacent to the original cabin, her fingers tracing the surface of a newly completed piece, a magnificent chandelier destined for a mansion in San Antonio. The metalwork depicted an entire forest canopy, with each leaf individually crafted and positioned to catch and scatter light like sunbeams filtering through real trees. It was Thomas's most ambitious creation to date, requiring 8 months of painstaking work and the coordinated efforts of 3 apprentices. Mrs. Brennan, came a familiar voice from the doorway. The photographer from Harper's Weekly has arrived for the interview. Charlotte turned toward Samuel Crawford, who was no longer the uncertain young man they had taken in 5 years earlier. Now 26, he had developed into a master craftsman in his own right, specializing in the delicate detail work that Thomas's larger vision required. His missing arm had never hindered his artistry. If anything, it had forced him to develop techniques that other metal workers couldn't replicate. "Samuel, have you seen Thomas?" The journalist specifically requested to observe him working. "He's in the new forge with Marcus and Elena, putting the finishing touches on the Denver Cathedral commission." Samuel's voice carried pride, mixed with respectful affection for his mentor. "You should see the altar screen they've created, Mrs. Brennan. It's going to change how people think about religious metalwork in America." Charlotte smiled at Samuel's enthusiasm. Marcus Hoffman, their second apprentice, had arrived 2 years earlier from Pennsylvania, drawn by stories of Thomas's teaching methods that had circulated through craftsmen's networks across the country. Elena Rodriguez had joined them just 6 months ago, the first woman ever accepted into their workshop. A decision that had scandalized conservative customers, but had proved invaluable when creating pieces for feminine spaces. The photographer, a precise man named William Hartley, emerged from the main workshop with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Brennan, your husband's work is extraordinary, but his teaching methodology is perhaps even more remarkable. I've never seen master-apprentice relationships that function with such seamless communication." Charlotte led Hartley toward the display area, where Thomas's most significant pieces were exhibited for visiting customers. Thomas believes that artistry transcends conventional communication. His apprentices learn to read metal and fire the way he does, understanding the craft through their hands rather than through words. The young woman, Miss Rodriguez, she mentioned that Mr. Brennan has developed entirely new techniques for incorporating precious metals into iron frameworks. Is this innovation driving your expansion into luxury markets? Charlotte had been anticipating this question. Their recent commissions included several pieces that incorporated gold and silver elements, creating metalwork that competed directly with the finest European artisans. Thomas doesn't consider himself an innovator, Mr. Hartley. He simply solves problems that other craftsmen haven't encountered. When a customer in San Francisco wanted serving pieces that would complement her collection of Asian ceramics, Thomas developed techniques for inlaying gold patterns that echo Oriental design motifs. They moved through the showroom with Charlotte, describing the evolution of Thomas's artistic vision, while Hartley made notes for his article. The original rustic mountain themes had expanded to encompass architectural elements from diverse cultural traditions, though always filtered through Thomas's distinctive understanding of how metal could be made to seem organic, alive. Mrs. Brennan, I understand you manage all customer correspondence and business development for the studio. How do you coordinate projects with clients you've never met across such vast distances? Charlotte gestured toward the office space that had evolved from her original correspondence corner into a sophisticated business operation. We've developed what I call collaborative design at distance. Each commission begins with extensive written exchanges where I help customers articulate their vision, while Thomas translates those ideas into preliminary sketches. We ship small sample pieces so customers can feel the textures and finishes before committing to larger works. And this system accommodates your husband's hearing impairment? Thomas's deafness isn't an impairment to our business, Mr. Hartley. It's an advantage. He communicates through visual and tactile channels that most people ignore. Our customers often say that Thomas understands their aesthetic preferences better than artisans who rely primarily on verbal communication. They were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar carriage in the courtyard. Charlotte recognized the sound of the horses before she heard the footsteps. Mrs. Morrison, arriving for her annual spring visit to commission new pieces and inspect the progress of her latest order. Evelyn, Charlotte called warmly, using the first name that their friendship had earned over 5 years of successful collaboration. Perfect timing. Mr. Hartley is writing an article about the studio for Harper's Weekly. Mrs. Morrison approached, with the confidence of someone who had become not just a customer, but a patron and advocate. Mr. Hartley, you're documenting something unprecedented in American craftsmanship. The Brennan Studio doesn't just create metalwork. They create heirloom narratives that families will treasure for generations. Hartley immediately began asking Mrs. Morrison about her experience as a customer, clearly recognizing the value of testimonial from someone of her social standing. When I first commissioned Thomas's work, I expected beautiful serving pieces, Mrs. Morrison explained. What I received was a complete transformation of how my family experiences hospitality. Every dinner party becomes an exhibition of American artistry. My guests don't just use these pieces, they study them, appreciate them, commission their own collections. And you've been instrumental in expanding the studio's reputation? Thomas and Charlotte have built something that transcends regional craftsmanship. They're creating a distinctly American artistic tradition that rivals anything produced in Europe. Mrs. Morrison gestured toward the chandelier that dominated the showroom. That piece will hang in the Whitman Mansion in San Antonio, but it could grace a palace in Vienna or a chateau in France without looking out of place. Charlotte felt a familiar glow of pride mixed with amazement at how far they had traveled from that desperate morning when she and her father had nearly died in the bakery fire. The business success was gratifying, but the personal transformation was even more remarkable. Through the showroom windows, she could see their newest addition to the property, a cottage that George Miller had designed and built himself as his mental clarity had continued to improve over the years. Her father now managed the studio's practical operations with the same methodical precision he had once brought to baking, his organizational skills proving invaluable as their business expanded. Mrs. Brennan, Hartley continued, What's next? For Brennan Mountain Metalworks, are you planning further expansion? Charlotte had been hoping he would ask this question. Thomas and I have been discussing the establishment of a school, not just for apprentices, but for accomplished craftsmen who want to learn his techniques for making metal appear organic, alive. A school? Here in the mountains? Why not? We have students traveling here from across the country already. Samuel. Crawford corresponds with metalworkers in 12 states who are trying to replicate Thomas's methods. Charlotte's voice grew more animated as she described their vision. We're thinking of a 6-month intensive program where established craftsmen could live here, work directly with Thomas, and return to their own studios with skills that would revolutionize American metalwork. Mrs. Morrison nodded enthusiastically. Charlotte has been developing this idea for months. She's already received inquiries from craftsmen in Boston, New Orleans, even Seattle. The business implications would be significant, Hartley observed. You'd be training your own competition. Charlotte had anticipated this concern as well. We'd be raising the standard of American craftsmanship, Mr. Hartley. Thomas doesn't fear competition from skilled artisans. He fears the decline of craftsmanship standards that comes from mass production and shortcuts. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices from the direction of the main house. Charlotte's face brightened immediately as she heard her 3-year-old daughter Catherine calling for Mama with the urgency that usually indicated an important discovery or minor catastrophe. "Excuse me for a moment," Charlotte said to Hartley, then moved toward the house where she could hear Catherine explaining something in the rapid, breathless style of excited toddlers. "Mama, Papa made me a horse, a metal horse that looks like Belle." Catherine ran toward Charlotte with the coordination of a child who had learned to navigate mountain terrain before she could properly walk. "It's got a real mane and everything." Charlotte knelt down to receive the enthusiastic hug that Catherine delivered with typical 3-year-old force. Her daughter placed a small metal sculpture in Charlotte's hands, indeed a miniature horse that captured Belle's distinctive proportions and gentle temperament with remarkable accuracy. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Did you watch Papa make it?" "I helped. I held the little hammer while Papa showed me how to make the mane curly." Catherine's excitement was infectious, and Charlotte could imagine Thomas patiently guiding small hands through the basic motions of metalwork. Behind Catherine, Charlotte heard slower footsteps and the sound of someone trying to suppress laughter. "That child has been talking about her horse for 3 days, came George Miller's voice. "Thomas finished it this morning, and she's convinced she's going to be a blacksmith when she grows up." "Just like Papa," Catherine announced with 3-year-old certainty, "except I'm going to make horses and birds and maybe dragons." Charlotte stood up, still holding the miniature horse, and felt the familiar wonder at how completely their lives had been transformed. Catherine had been born into a world of love and creativity, surrounded by adults who valued both artistic excellence and practical skill. She would grow up believing that deaf people and blind people were simply people with different ways of experiencing the world, that partnerships were built on mutual respect and complementary strengths, that beautiful things were worth the time and effort required to create them properly. "Mr. Hartley," Charlotte called back toward the showroom, "would you like to meet the next generation of Brennan Mountain Metalworks?" Hartley approached with his photographer, clearly charmed by Catherine's confident chatter about her artistic ambitions. "Miss Catherine, do you really want to be a blacksmith like your father?" "Papa says I can be anything I want if I work hard and practice every day," Catherine replied with the seriousness that small children brought to important topics. "But I like making beautiful things, so I think I'll make beautiful things." "And what does your mother think about that plan?" Catherine looked up at Charlotte with complete confidence. "Mama says girls can do anything boys can do, just sometimes in different ways. She runs the whole business and Papa makes the art, and together, they're the best team in the world." Charlotte felt tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. Catherine's casual confidence in her own capabilities, her assumption that artistic careers were normal and practical options, her understanding that partnerships were built on equality and mutual support, all of this represented the kind of world Charlotte had dreamed of creating, but had never quite dared to believe possible. As Hartley continued his interviews and photography session, Charlotte walked toward the main forge where she could hear the familiar rhythm of Thomas's work. She found him putting the finishing touches on a section of the cathedral altar screen, with Marcus and Elena working on complementary panels nearby. Thomas looked up when he sensed her presence, and his face immediately brightened with the smile that still made her heart skip after 5 years of marriage. He set down his tools and moved toward her, his hands automatically reaching for the ever-present writing tablet. But instead of writing, he simply pulled her into a gentle embrace, and Charlotte understood exactly what he wanted to communicate. In his arms, surrounded by the warmth of the forge and the sound of their apprentices working, she felt the same sense of completion that had marked every significant moment of their life together. "The journalist wants to know about our plans." "Over the school," Charlotte murmured against his shoulder. "I told him you'd be willing to teach other craftsmen your techniques." Thomas nodded, then reached for his tablet. If sharing knowledge helps preserve real craftsmanship, then sharing knowledge serves the greater good. Besides, teaching forces me to understand my own methods more clearly. And you're not concerned about creating competition. Thomas wrote with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust his own judgment. Mediocre work creates competition. Exceptional work creates appreciation. We will always have customers who understand the difference. Charlotte kissed his cheek, tasting the familiar combination of smoke and metal that clung to his skin after hours in the forge. "Catherine announced that she's going to be a blacksmith when she grows up. Should we be concerned?" Thomas's silent laughter shook his shoulders as he wrote, "She has the attention span for detail work and the determination to solve problems. She might actually be better at this than either of us." A family dynasty of mountain metal workers? Why not? By the time Catherine is ready to learn seriously, we'll have the school established. She can learn from masters who trained with us, developing skills we can't even imagine yet. Charlotte looked around the forge, noting the improvements they had made over the years. Better ventilation, more sophisticated tools, workspace designed specifically for collaborative projects. Everything about their operation reflected the same principle that guided their marriage: thoughtful planning combined with willingness to adapt when circumstances changed. "Thomas," she said softly, "do you ever think about that morning when you found us by your door? Do you wonder what would have happened if you had decided not to come down from the mountain that day?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing thoughtful. Then he wrote carefully, "I think about it often, not with regret, but with gratitude that desperation brought you to exactly the place where you belonged. Your father once said that the best partnerships help each person become more than they could be alone. Every day you prove that truth." Charlotte squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his artistic dedication. "We've built something beautiful, haven't we? Not just the business, but this whole life. We've built something that will outlast us," Thomas wrote. "Something that will continue growing long after we're gone. Catherine will carry forward what we've started, and her children will take it even further." Outside the forge, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the pine trees, casting the familiar golden light that had marked so many important moments in their shared story. In the distance, Charlotte could hear the evening train whistle from the valley below, and closer by, the sounds of their extended family preparing for dinner. Samuel calling to Marcus about tomorrow's work schedule. Elena laughing at something Catherine had said. George Miller's voice drifting from the main house as he discussed supply orders with their newest business correspondent. Their mountain sanctuary had become something neither of them had originally envisioned, not just a refuge from the world's harsh judgments, but a center of artistic innovation that was changing how America thought about craftsmanship and beauty. They had taken their personal healing and transformed it into something that healed others, creating beauty that would endure for generations while building a chosen family that honored both tradition and innovation. As they walked back toward the house for dinner, Charlotte reflected on the unexpected ways that disaster had led to blessing, how loss had created space for unprecedented gain, how two broken people had discovered that their individual damages fit together like pieces of a puzzle designed by Providence. The fire that had destroyed her old life seemed like ancient history now, important only because it had forced her toward the future she was meant to inhabit. Thomas's accident had removed him from a world that didn't value his gifts and led him to a place where those gifts could flourish beyond anything he had dared to imagine. Their mountain had indeed kept its promise, but more than that, they had kept their promises to each other, to honor their individual strengths, to support each other's dreams, to build something together that was greater than the sum of their separate possibilities. As the sun set behind the peaks they had come to love, Charlotte Miller Brennan understood that some stories don't really end. They simply transition into new chapters, carried forward by people who understand that love, like metal shaped in fire, becomes stronger and more beautiful when it's tested by challenges and refined through patient dedication. They were home. They were family. They were exactly where they belonged. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.